Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you join us today. Welcome. We are so excited to have our esteemed panel also with us today. My name is Irvin Scott. I'm a senior lecturer here at Harvard Graduate School of Education. My particular focus is on educational leadership. I've been a principal and a district leader and also a leader at the Gates Foundation. And I direct the Leadership Institute for Faith and Education, which is an effort to look at the intersection, the powerful intersection, I believe, between faith and educating America's children. At Harvard Graduate School of Education, we are committed to not only thinking about, but also engaging in strategies that allow us to practically celebrate and move toward greater equity, access, and justice across lines of race, worldview, class, gender, and geography. Before coming to the faculty here at Harvard, I was deputy director, as I said, for K-12 education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, after spending about 20 years or so in the trenches, I like to say, as a teacher, principal, district leader, which I love. Probably the position I loved the most was teaching high school English to students. Love that. The arc of my personal and professional journey demonstrates a commitment, and I suspect this is true about many people on the line right now, demonstrates a commitment to justice and love. The one thing that I should have said also is that I have a personal background in the church. My father is a pastor, remains a pastor at 85 years old, and Greater Good News Church of God in Christ. So I grew up in the church and am an ordained elder. So this notion of justice and love go hand in hand in my both personal and professional experiences. And I suspect that's true about many people on the line, and definitely our guests. For these reasons, I am delighted to welcome you all to Justice Loves. Justice Loves, an exploration of justice through the lens of love. I was just sharing with my students not too long ago the importance of educators using the word love, at least in the work that they do, being driven by this notion of love. And then, of course, based on what's going on in our country, even today, justice becomes such an important word to connect to love. So we're putting those both together today, and we're so happy to have you. This event was intentionally planned for this month. We believe Black history is American history all year round, and we are grateful for the commemorative time to honor our history this month. Additionally, we planned this event to coincide with Valentine's Day, right? A holiday that often is celebrated with acts of love and kindness, because we wanted to emphasize the point that justice also requires a similar commitment of action. Our hope is that today that you will leave this Zoom experience with greater clarity on how you can do justice in your spheres of influence all year round, bringing these two things together, not just for a weekend, not just for a month, but all year round. I will turn it over to my friend, colleague, student, Amelia Thompson, a student of mine, to formally introduce the panel. But I wanted to personally thank Dr. Gary Chapman, Mr. Derek Minor, and Mr. David Simas and to thank you on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Education for taking time in your full and very busy schedules to join us today. I have an all-day meeting that I was just explaining to our panelists, a board meeting that I have been a part of, stepped out to do this welcome because I'm so excited about this conversation, so excited about our guests joining us and them making the sacrifice to join us. Unfortunately, I have to jump back into that board meeting eventually, but I'm looking forward to being a part of it for the beginning. But I'm so excited to have you. Thank you for joining us. Amelia, thank you for your deep commitment to this work. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. And thank you, everyone, for being with us. If we were in an auditorium, we would applaud Dr. Scott, but in the absence of doing so, please, of being able to do so, please drop some emoji love in the chat. And maybe emojis are your love language. And if so, you're in the right place today. So thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for being with us. We are so excited to have you all here. As Dr. Scott said, I'm a student here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm a candidate in the International Education and Policy Program. And I'm just totally overjoyed to bring this discussion to you. Today, as Dr. Scott said, we have Dr. Gary Chapman, whose work is the inspiration for JusticeLoves. Dr. Chapman is a well-known marriage counselor and director of marriage seminars. The 5 Love Languages is one of his top bestsellers, and it's topped the charts for years. It's sold over 12 million copies and has been on the New York Times bestsellers list since 2007. Today, we are fortunate to have Dr. Chapman join us from North Carolina. I think Salem? Winston-Salem?
Winston-Salem.
Awesome. And we are also just super grateful and excited and honored to have Mr. Derek Minor with us. After a decade of making music, this award-winning artist has established himself as a leading voice of hope in the midst of darkness. In 2009, he founded Reflection Music Group, and among his achievements include winning a Grammy for his production on Lecrae's album Gravity. In 2020, he founded WeOwnNow to support Black ownership. And Derek is joining us today from his hometown, Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for being here.
Hello, everybody. Hey, how you doing?
Super grateful and honored as well to have Mr. David Simas, CEO of the Obama Foundation, with us. David is from Massachusetts, but he's calling in today from DC, but he lives in Chicago. David was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff by Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick in 2007, and David joined President Obama's administration in 2009. Following President Obama's re-election, David returned to the White House as assistant to the president and director of the Office of Political Strategy and Outreach. And we're just super grateful and honored to have him with us as well. Thank you, David, for being here.
It's a real honor and a joy to be with all of you today. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Thank you. And so as Dr. Scott said, our goals are for you to have a clear sense of how you can engage in the work of doing justice all year round. And fortunately, today we are not being brought together by a tragic event or crisis. We've witnessed more than enough of those. Today, we want to talk concretely about work that's happening around the country to heal and strengthen relationships and broaden and deepen the work of equity and justice. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Chapman for him to share a bit about the 5 love languages, and then I'll share a bit about JusticeLoves, and then we'll turn it over to David and to Derek. And you'll also have the opportunity, feel free to post questions using the Q&A board and to also enjoy the chat. But I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Chapman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amelia. It's great to be with all of you. And I love putting the words love and justice together. And so it's great to be a part of this panel. People have often asked me, where did I derive the 5 love languages? It really grew out of my counseling. I have worked on a church staff as an associate pastor of marriage and family counseling now for over 40 years. And years ago, I realized that what makes one person feel loved doesn't necessarily make another person feel loved. They would sit in my office and, for example, and a wife would say, I just feel like he doesn't love me. And he would say, I don't understand that. I do this and this and this. Why would you not feel loved? And I knew that people could be sincere and still be missing each other emotionally. And so eventually I said, there's got to be a pattern to this. And so I sat down and read several years of notes that I made when I was counseling and asked myself the question, when someone said in my office, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want? What were they complaining about? And their answers fell into 5 categories. And I later called them the 5 love languages. And I started using this in my counseling, that in a marriage, if you want him to feel loved, you've got to express love in his language. If you want her to feel loved, you've got to express love in her language. And sometimes I would help people discover their primary love language, and they would come back in 3 weeks and say, Gary, this is changing everything. The whole climate's different now. And then I started using it with small groups of couples, and the same thing would happen. Probably 5 years later, I thought, if I could put this concept in a book, write it in the language of the common person, maybe I could help a lot of couples that I would never have time to see in my office. Little did I know that the book would sell, as you said, 12 million copies in English and be translated and published in over 50 languages around the world. It says to me that this deep need for love is one of our deepest emotional needs, regardless of our culture, regardless of our race. We have this deep longing to be loved, especially by the significant people in our lives. And so I'll just share briefly the love languages because I think this is a format in terms of how to express love to other people. And please don't hear me saying you only speak their primary love language. Any one of these 5 is going to communicate love. But each of us has, I believe, a primary love language, and that's the one that really speaks most deeply to us. These are in no particular order. Words of affirmation, using words to affirm the other person. You look nice in that outfit. I really appreciate what you did. One of the things I like about you is just using words to affirm the person. There's an ancient Hebrew proverb that says life and death is in the power of the tongue. You can kill people by the way you talk to them, or you can give them life. So words of affirmation. And then there's acts of service, doing something for the person that they would like for you to do. In a marriage, that is such things as washing dishes, cooking meals, vacuuming floors, washing cars, mowing grass, walking the dog, changing the baby's diaper. Ooh, that's a big one. But anything, in a business setting, it might be helping somebody with their computer. It's what my assistant does for me all the time. I say, Anita, help me with this. It's doing something for the other person. Remember the old saying, actions speak louder than words. And they do, and especially if this is your primary love language. And then there's gifts. It's universal to give gifts as an expression of love. My academic background before I studied counseling was anthropology. I did an undergrad and a master's in anthropology. We've studied cultures all over the world. And there are no cultures where people do not give gifts as an expression of love. The gift says they were thinking about me. Look what they gave me. And the gift doesn't have to be expensive. We've always said it's the thought that counts. But I remind you, it's not the thought left in your head that counts. It's the gift that came out of the thought in your head, okay? A guy told me the other day, said, Dr. Chapman, I knew my wife's language was gifts. So I was taking a walk and I saw a bird feather and I picked it up. I took it home. I said, honey, I was walking and I found this bird feather and I want to give it to you because, girl, you are the wind beneath my wings. Woo! He hit a home run. Didn't cost him a thing. He gave a gift and words of affirmation. So gifts, and then quality time, by which I mean you give the other person your undivided attention. I don't mean sitting around watching television together. Someone else shares your attention. I mean the TV's off, the computer's down. We're not answering the phone. We're giving each other our undivided attention, asking, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What could I do for you? How could we enhance our relationship? Quality time. And for some people, this is what really makes them feel loved. These are the kind of people that can sit down and have an hour and a half lunch and just absolutely love talking for an hour and a half with a friend. Okay, quality time. And then there's physical touch. We've long known the emotional power of physical touch. That's why we pick up babies and hold them and kiss them and cuddle them long before the baby understands the meaning of the word love. The baby feels love by physical touch. So There are appropriate touches and inappropriate touches, to be sure, in all human relationships. Now, I discovered this originally with married couples, but I realized very early on this applies in the parent-child relationship as well. To parents, I say, the question is not, do you love your children? The question is, do your children feel loved? See, by nature, we love our children, but not all children feel loved. I remember a 13-year-old who sat in my office and said, Dr. Ch, he'd run away from home, and he ended up in my office, and he said, my parents don't love me. They love my brother. They don't love me. I knew his parents. I knew they loved him. Problem is, they had never learned how to communicate love in a language that spoke deeply to him. So this applies to children, whether they're young children or whether they're teenagers. It applies in friendships. I wrote an edition on the 5 love languages for single adults, applying this to their relationship with their parents, their siblings, their college roommates, their dating partners, their work associates. So really, we've applied it in almost any relationship you can imagine now over the last several years. And it really does make a difference. And what I want to say it again, please don't hear me saying that you only speak a person's primary love language. No, you speak heavy doses of the primary, but you sprinkle in the other 4. You get extra credit for that, okay? But if you don't speak their primary, they may not feel loved, even though you're speaking some of the others. And particularly with children, I say to parents, listen, the ideal is that you will speak all 5 of these languages to your child, and they'll learn how to receive love in all 5 and learn how to speak all 5. That's the healthiest adult. Most of us did not receive all 5 growing up, and we have to learn some of these as an adult. But if you want to grow a child that's going to be emotionally stable and healthy, and also know how to socially relate to people, you're doing them a tremendous service if you love them in all 5 and you speak all and teach them how to speak all 5. So that's the basic concept. And I think that because this is, I think, one of our deepest emotional needs, it has tremendous influence in how we treat other people. And you can know that if you're speaking one of these languages to an individual, you are really communicating something that's super meaningful to them. And if you get to know them well enough to discover their primary love language, this is where friendships are built. It's when we learn how to love each other. And, one of my themes through the years has been, let's learn to love across racial and cultural lines. We're not doing very well with this in many, many circles. And if we can, just imagine what would happen if every one of us had a close personal friend. I'm talking about friendship. I'm not talking about acquaintances, a close personal friend of another race or culture. Imagine what that would do to our culture. This passion grows out of my own relationship with Dr. Clarence Schuler, African-American friend of mine. I've known him since he was 14 years old. And we started a relationship. We never intended it was going to be a lifelong relationship, but it's been that. His father died a couple of years after I met him, and I kind of became a father to him, and we just had this close relationship. He's in his 60s now, and just he's doing a great thing. He's marriage counseling and other things. And I just wish every individual could have that kind of relationship. And I think the basis of it is love, because love is an attitude which says, I'm here to enrich the lives of other people. With whatever gifts I have and whatever abilities I have, and we all have different gifts and abilities, but if we have an attitude of love, that I am here to enrich the lives of other people, we can build positive relationships across racial and cultural lines, and do everything we can to enrich the lives of other people. If we could get it down, it would work. I really am convinced. All right, let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapman. Let's show Dr. Chapman some emoji love. And so JusticeLoves was born out of the idea of the 5 love languages. And so we're going to share our screen to talk you through them. But the first one, the idea that love, the idea of receiving gifts, the justice expression is that justice gives away. So you find ways of supporting causes or artists and initiatives, elected officials that are aligned with justice values. The love language of service is that you find causes to volunteer in and to support and to physically engage in. And so justice serves others. The idea of quality time is expressed as justice pays attention. And so you make an effort to become informed about key issues of injustice. That might mean watching 13th on Netflix or reading how to be an anti-racist. But you take the time to become well informed about issues of justice and injustice. The idea of physical touch, we have to really thank Dr. Scott for this language because he looked to Bryan Stevenson's work on proximity to help us understand that justice gets close. And so you get proximate with those who've experienced injustice and with those who are experiencing suffering because of injustice. And so you also draw near, and that might mean through relationships, as Dr. Chapman discussed, and get close to injustice and those who've been impacted by it. And then finally, the love language of words of affirmation is expressed as justice speaks out. And so you use your voice. That might be on social media. That might be in your own spheres of influence. That might be at your dinner tables to speak out and to call out injustice. And so those are the 5 justice languages. And we're going to share a full poster that describes and defines each one in the chat in case you're interested in downloading it and using it in your own context. And on that note, we reached out to Derek Minor and David Simas because their work intersects these languages of justice. And we'd love to hear from them to talk about their work and how they define justice. So we'll start with Derek, and then we'll hear from David.
Yes. So the question is, what is justice to me? To me, justice, I sat and pondered about this for a while, and I think the conclusion I came to is fiercely upholding the humanity of others. I think at times we could get so bogged down with the idea of money and finances and all those different things, but when it comes down to it, what Dr. Chapman said is correct. Across every culture, everyone just wants to be loved, and everyone wants to have dignity and humanity. And I think that if we were to fight for those things, that we would see a more equitable justice system. So that's another thing that I would like to cue in on, is the idea of that justice is not just person to person, but it's also systemic. Like, the fight has to start at the systemic level as well. We have to do both. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So as we love our neighbor, we also fight to create a system that is equitable for everyone. And that would be my definition. That's what I'm fighting.
Thanks, Derek. David, would you like to share about your work and how you define justice?
Of course. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. I have the great honor every day of getting up and working for Barack and Michelle Obama. And as a son of 2 Portuguese immigrants who came to the United States in 1968 into a new world with a lot of hope and dreams, to be able to walk into that building every day and serve them and serve this country is just a gift. The way the President and Mrs. Obama have thought about the work that goes forward, it's around a notion of what leadership requires. And leadership, not just in people who hold titles, but the understanding that when you and I are in a community together, I have a responsibility to you. And it isn't just a consumptive form of engagement where engaging is just voting or just going to a meeting or a march. There is a reciprocity that's required in leadership that begins with an understanding of another person. And so justice in some ways is the way the president has talked about it, is a derivative of the golden rule, right? Treat other human beings the way that you would want to be treated yourself. And if you anchor every single choice that you make on a day-to-day basis around a sense of, and this is where love comes in an agape sense of selfless and sacrificial and unconditional, where you can remove yourself from the dualism of me versus you and begin with that expression of, I am here to be of service to you. Because at the end of the day, you want the same things, as Derek said, that I want. I want to be happy. I want to be loved. And so what we are developing, both in the United States and overseas, is a notion of servant leadership, of compassionate leadership. In the words of my old boss, the former governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, who said, you can lead in one of two ways: by having people turn to each other or on each other. And the inherent truth in that is that all of us, including myself on a day-to-day basis, can easily be triggered by ego, vanity, fear, anxiety, that then cordons myself off from others. Or I can be turning to compassion and kindness and generosity and that sense of interconnectedness. It's a moment-by-moment choice that then becomes the basis of what leading in the way that we want to spread throughout the United States and globally. So that's my view of it.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Derek. And Dave, it's really beautiful language that you've allowed us to start with. We'd love to hear a bit about your own career paths and how justice has shaped your career journeys and the work that you're currently doing now, any specific initiatives that you're undertaking. So we'll start with you, Derek, and your work with WeOwnNow.
Yeah, so my grandfather owned a construction business. He, from Pontiac, Michigan. He's originally from Mississippi. He was a sharecropper there and served in the military, moved to Pontiac, Michigan. And I think he worked for GM, my mom said, for like 10 years. And then after that, he started his own construction business. And what would happen, being a Black man in the city, he would get, first off, he wouldn't get jobs that he bid for, even if he was qualified a lot. He would get outbid by other companies. That'd be the, the cronyism. And when he would get jobs, things like this would happen. He would, they'd say, hey, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars. He wouldn't take any money, and he'd give it to his crew in hopes that on the back half, he would get the rest of his money later. So he'd give the draw to the people that were working for him, and then he'd get on the back half. Well, companies would go bankrupt, and after he completed the work, he wouldn't get the rest of his money. Things like that would happen. Completely legal, right? Completely legal, but is it right though, right? No, not right. But his desire to, he always would tell me, you have to own your own stuff. And he would say it in a way, a very, very Mississippi way, where he like, Derek, you got to own something. And as I got older, I'm from Pontiac, Michigan. That's where I grew up. And I grew up in Columbia, Tennessee. And as I got older, I was asking myself, like, what's going on in my community? I had family members that were in jail, family members that struggled, different things like that. And by the grace of the Most High, I've been able to do some extraordinary things. But as I have done those extraordinary things, I asked myself, like, how did I get here? What is up with our community? And it was, I started researching what's going on with our community. I found a couple stats, okay? Stat number one is, at the end of the Civil War, Black people owned half of 1% of the wealth in this country. Now, if you fast forward to today, Black people own 1.5% of the wealth of this country. It's 1.5. We went up 13% on 1.5% of the wealth. Now, you would say, well, what is that, right? Personal responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there are some personal responsibility issues there. But at the same time, we have people like Uncle Nearest Green, who created the recipe for Jack Daniels as a slave, who never got to actually own and participate in the creation that he made, right? Or we would look at tons of different people, Black people over time, who have created things that never got to participate in it. And then after a while, what winds up happening is that intellectual property is passed down from person to person to person to person, to a stat where you see now today, 1 in 7 white people are millionaires. 1 in 50 Black people are millionaires. So we're not talking about just money in the bank. We're talking about assets. That stuff is accumulated by being passed down from generation to generational wealth. That is the key there. And I started thinking, like, how do we change the narrative? How do we fix this? Well, there's a justice component, right? But then also at the same time, I wanted to empower the people that I have in my sphere of influence to say, hey, own your home, own equities and stocks, own your financial future, and be able to pass that down to your kids. As even the scriptures would say, that it's important for us to be able to pass down wealth even down to the second generation. When you read even in the Old Testament, that's what it was all about. The land of Canaan was an inheritance given by God to the Hebrews. And the idea was, you need to pass this down to your generations. So that's the goal for me, is to help our minority brothers and sisters to be able to have equity and to make up for some of the lack of justice that we've experienced in this country in the past. So that's how it influenced my work, and that's where my passion comes from.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. We feel that passion, and we're grateful for it. We'd love to hear from you, David, and your work and any specific initiatives that are currently happening with the Obama Foundation, both locally and abroad.
So very quickly, on a personal level, I do the work that I do because when I was very young, my mother was working in a factory. She had a 4th grade education. My father had a 4th grade education. They were immigrants. All they could do was work, and work really hard. And one day my father came to the babysitter's house, and in a Portuguese family, that's my aunt, and said that my mother had lost 2 fingers because the machine that was making the forks and spoons and knives malfunctioned. But malfunctioned because someone, for whatever reason, cut a corner. When you're an immigrant, or when you're notwithstanding an immigrant, but when you're working that type of labor, all you have are your hands and your back. All you have. And so within a second, notwithstanding all of the hopes and dreams and intentions, life takes you in a very different path. What I saw every day was my grandfather, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, my neighbors, and coworkers, and person after person after person who were experiencing the life that my parents had, coming to the house, helping and cooking and filling a gap, because when we fell, the community and the family knew that they had a responsibility to lift us up. And literally every single day that I walked into the White House for those years that I did, I began the day and ended the day with the same mantra, which was, remember who you are and what you represent. Because you're not here because you're the smartest or the most connected or the most brilliant. You worked hard, yes. But when you fell, there were people there to lift you and your family up. There, but for the grace of God, go I. And so our responsibility, my responsibility from this point forward, given all that I have been given, is to make sure that I reciprocate and give to others. And so the tangible example of the way the work of the Obama Foundation meets this moment is in the wake of the protests that erupted this summer after the murder of George Floyd and so many others. We have a program called My Brother's Keeper, which is based on that notion of the responsibility we have to one another. Not necessarily to do for, echoing what Derek said, but to provide resources and to show the way and to connect and to open doors. And so we did something very simple. We put up a pledge online that said, if you are a mayor or a county executive, here are 4 things that you should pledge to do around police violence. 350 mayors have taken that pledge, representing 70 million Americans, including 1 out of every 3 African Americans in the country. Every other week, those mayors would show up and receive training on implicit bias, new methods of policing, ways to discipline. What were we doing? We weren't teaching, we were providing a platform for others to come in to teach while these mayors were listening. So that was step 1. For me, the most important part was step 2. There was a town hall, and oh my goodness, it was amazing to watch. It was Barack Obama, Brian Stevenson, and God rest his soul, John Lewis, in one of his final appearances. And they were talking about justice in health and what you needed to do to steel yourself for moments like this. Well, within 72 hours of that town hall being over 700,000 people throughout the country had signed their own pledge of how they were going to engage in the community. What did we do? We provided them the platform, gave them some resources to show them the way to go from an activist to an organizer. And to do it in a strategic way, not me doing it for you, but here is all of the good that has been done for me. Therefore, here are the resources that, because of the connections that we have, we will make available for others. That's one way to meet this moment.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, David. Also, really, and I see that those our guests and audience also really connecting with your personal stories, which is so powerful. And I'll share a bit about my own in terms of why justice matters to me. I'm also a child of an immigrant. My mom is Haitian, and she gave me up for adoption. So I was placed in foster care in about a month, when I was a month old. And I was raised by a woman from North Carolina, a sharecropping family in North Carolina. She was born in 1926. She has since passed, and she only made it to the 6th grade. And so to be here at HGSE and thinking about the 2 mothers whose legacy I carry on, and to be hearing and to hear your conversations, to hear your own personal narratives is really deeply inspiring. So thank you for sharing them and for being with us today. So in the audience, we have students here at HGSE. We also have parents. We have activists. We have consultants. And so I'd love to hear, and Dr. Chapman, feel free to weigh in as well. How would you encourage those who are with us to think about justice in your own spheres of influence, and to help and to allow justice to sort of guide their own career paths? Dr. Chapman, are you speaking? Because you're on mute.
Yeah, I would just say a word because I want to hear what the others have to say as well. You know, I think it all begins with a heart attitude and choosing an attitude of love. We're not going to do anything to change things if we don't have an attitude of love. And the good thing is we choose our attitudes. We don't choose our emotions. The emotions are affected by circumstances, but we choose our attitude. And if we have an attitude of love, then all of us are different. We're in different places. We have different roles of influence. Then what we want to do is use whatever platform we have in whatever way we can to see that fairness is done in every area of life. I obviously have a deep passion for marriage and family. because I believe that many of the social problems we have grow out of family life. And when families are broken and children grow up in broken families and they hear arguments and fighting and all of that, and, you know, broken families produce broken and hurt people. So me and thousands of other counselors around the country focus our time on individuals. So to use Dr. Scott's term, we're in the trenches. We're down in the trenches. Others are doing other things, but we're dealing with trying to help individuals come out of whatever circumstance they're in, from brokenness into healing, so that they can then in turn reach their potential in life. So I think, you know, it's understanding that we have different avenues in which we take the gifts that we have and we seek to use them where we are. But it all comes back to an attitude of love, and that's what I've heard from Derek and David both. When you have that, then you're looking for ways that you can enhance the situation. So.
I believe we live in a culture of extremism and complacency, unfortunately. Like when you, especially because, you know, like when you think about social media and all types of different things, when people think about justice, we think about, or inequality, we think about the most extreme things. We think about the Ku Klux Klan. We think about all types of things that are extremely extreme and often very rare. And we also live in a place of complacency and convenience, right? So we'll pay more for convenience. We'll pay more to continue being complacent. I think that we can see change when we begin to embrace change. We have to embrace it. Like we have to say, this is going to cost me something. So in your own sphere of influence, if you're an employer, it may cost you being uncomfortable to hire someone who doesn't look like you to give them a chance. We have to embrace that. It may cost me to say, I'm gonna be uncomfortable to, like as Dr. Chapman talked earlier about us having real relationships. Having real relationships with people that don't look like us, it costs something. It's uncomfortable, but you know what? You grow. It's the same way with dieting and eating right and working out. You're not going to lose pounds by osmosis, by thinking about it, by just sitting there and relaxing. What's the same thing with justice and change and equality? We don't get this from just sitting by and thinking about, oh my goodness, how can things change? We do it by action. We do it by taking steps to be uncomfortable and by doing practical things, which is, it could be whatever your sphere of influence is. I don't know what that is, but use it to the best of your ability. Count the cost, take the leap.
And when I think about that question of sphere of influence, the first thing is obviously to turn inwards and begin with what you care about deeply. Understand in that notion of servant leadership, what is right speech? How do you approach the engagement with people? What are your objectives? Do you intend to just raise an issue, or do you intend to move the ball down the field? Each one of those are choices and paths, but that is an internal reflection. And then there are 4 quick steps. They're not quick, but this is an approach that I think about a lot. Essentially, it's narrative, issue mapping, power mapping, and asset inventory. Those are the 4 component parts that then allow you to exercise within your sphere of influence. Issue mapping. What is that thing that I care so deeply about that rather than be paid to do it, I would actually pay to do that thing? And then once you think about that, understand that there are very few things that are binary. What are the root causes of those things that drive that? Understand it deeply. If you want to affect change, You need to go down to roots. Number 2, power mapping. Once you determine what you want to do, who are the people and or organizations who are in a position of power to move that forward? And once you determine who those people are, who do they turn to for influence? Where do they derive their power from? Is it legal? Is it regulatory? Is it reputational? Is it financial? It's all different, but it can be mapped. Once you've mapped that out, asset inventory. I can't change anything by myself. Who are the people, organizations, and allies that I can bring to bear in a way that can meet the strategic imperative of whatever the power systems are? And then finally, narrative. But humans, to the point that Dr. Chapman said, and I love that deeply, and I try to live by that, I don't control my feelings. I don't control my emotions. They arise, and they arise when I don't want them to. And then there is the gap between when it hits me and when I choose to respond. If that gap is enlarged, in some ways, that's where wisdom comes in and I have more control. If the gap is closed, I am reacting. Someone else is in control of me in a paradoxical kind of way. So narrative is understanding the way, even when you speak, the sign that you make, the petition that you draft. You know how it hits yourself, but how will it hit others? How can you put yourself in the shoes of the person who is receiving the message in a way that is strategically focused on moving the objective forward? And so that's a framework that, regardless of sphere of influence or the way you're planning to act, at least for me, has been a good guide.
That's terrific. Thank you, David. We'd love to open the floor to questions. Also, while you're here, your love language may be giving, and we have 2 great initiatives to give to, the Obama Foundation and WeOwnNow. And so we're going to drop the links to both in the chat. And even if your primary love language is not giving, we encourage you to tap into a secondary or tertiary love language today, because the Obama Foundation and WeOwnNow are doing fantastic work, and we want to see that work advance. And so we encourage you to give and to encourage others to give. Any questions? I see. Frankie, if you don't mind, do you want me? I'm going to allow you to ask your question. I see your question on the Q&A board, so I'm going to unmute you, and you can ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate all the insight that everyone is providing. This chat is like fire for me right now. But when I think about justice and I'm thinking about the love languages and how I approach these situations, what I struggle with the most is when I can already have a sense that the other side or the other individual has created a sort of a wall. And oftentimes when I encounter people that are evading situations that do make them uncomfortable, it's like, how do I then move myself forward? Or like, how do I see the needle moving forward or not? Because at times I feel like I run into a roadblock with what it is that I'm actually trying to achieve and trying to promote justice and speaking through the love languages.
If I could just say a word to that, I think this is where relationships, and friendships, the deepest of relationships, this is where this plays a huge role. Because if I get to know you, and you know me, and we share life with each other, I can see your perspective, you can see my perspective. We treat each other with dignity and respect, and consequently, I'm willing to help you accomplish, whatever goal you have. If I can go along with it and feel like it's good, obviously. I mean, we all have different ideas, but and this is why I champion this idea of building friendships across racial lines. Now, I know we can't make friends with everybody. I mean, friendship takes time. You're spending time with each other. You're having them in your home. You're having meals together. You know each other's children if you're married, and you know where they are, and you're each doing what you can to help each other. This again is in the trenches. But the more we can have friendships with people that we're trying to bring into our efforts, whatever they are, the easier that's going to be. But what you're saying is, I think, a part of our culture today is that we're fighting each other rather than loving each other. So if I disagree with you, then I'm going to try to put you down. Or you disagree with me, you'll put me down. Well, we don't going to get anywhere. We're just making things worse when we're fighting each other. So this whole thing of friendship, to me, it's an underlying climate changer in the culture. If we can begin to make that happen in the culture.
I agree completely with what Dr. Chapman just said, and trying to remember my old line of work in politics where this really manifests itself, but even now applying it to notions of social justice. One thing that I learned by watching 500 nights of focus groups, of listening to people behind the wall, suspending judgment, letting it wash in. You never, ever persuade someone to change their opinion if you trigger a defense reaction. Ever. It won't work. The only time I ever saw people being persuaded to being open to considering a different perspective is if there was some commonality of values, some shared experience that essentially allowed them to introduce the notion of, in some ways, it's this cognitive dissonance. I'm having a negative reaction to what you're saying, but because I have made some connection with you, where I'm from Massachusetts, so I'm like in my bones, I'm a Red Sox fan. I'm walking through Piccadilly Circus in London a couple of years ago, and there are 10,000 people there. I see some guy with a Red Sox hat. Immediately, joy and a connection because of something as absurd as that. But what did it imply? Like, I could begin to talk to that guy, and we know where the conversation would begin. Every single person, all of us, you put us in a room for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And if you approach it with that kind of beginner's mind, that spirit of curiosity that I want to learn about you, we'll find connections. And Frankie, once you find that connection, even with someone who finds you to be odious and vice versa because of a specific issue that is important and principled, you find that connection, you can begin to say, I disagree with you here. And then you look for a way to say, while I disagree with you, what you said, I hear where you're coming from. And that magic of I hear where you're coming from, where it's not feigned, where it's not fake, where it's not transactional, is literally like a key. Because then the person feels heard and seen and validated and respected, and that defense mechanism begins to erode. Then you can begin to speak. Hard to do. So I don't mean to be all kinds of preachy and say, here's a secret sauce, but I don't know another way.
Yeah, I think I'll echo that in the sense that I know in my youth, even now, with everything, I want to just be like a running back and run the ball down the middle to the touchdown goal. It's like, hold up, we're doing this justice thing. Why isn't it working? And I'm stiff arming everybody. But I think sometimes especially in America, the racial trauma is so thick that it's going to take time. We have to embrace that. I think that we have to embrace that with people. It may take a long time to develop a safe place where people feel comfortable to be able to talk about those things. We have to be okay with that and expect it. But I also think, the Bible says it's through love and kindness that he draws us. But then I also think that we have to also understand that we may not be the person that gets to see the fruit of what we planted. You never know. I may be loving on a person, that brick wall may be up, and then they go somewhere else, and bam, that person gets to see the fruit of the seed that was planted. Like the scriptures say, one plant, one water. It's God who gives the increase, right? So we don't know when that seed is going to bear fruit. And I think that at times we got to be okay with that I might just be the planter getting dirty, and then I have to walk away, So.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Derek. And even in some ways, I think that that analogy that you just used about planting, in some ways, we are the fruit of the seeds of righteousness and justice that our parents planted, right? And so our families may not have attained the degree of even like financial freedom that they want, but because of the seeds that they sowed, that your mother sowed, in David, in that factory, you're here and able to share so powerfully with us today. So thank you for that. There is a question from Sonia Denise, and so I'm going to unmute you so that you can share, and then also Nicole. I see a question from you, but David, there's one question in chat. The framework that you mentioned, is that available anywhere? I saw Innocent and Nicole asked that.
It has different forms. Let me see what I can rustle up and share with you, Amelia, then to distribute to the group.
Thank you so much, David.
Of course.
Sonia.
Thank you so much. I'm just curious, how do you manage corrupt power maps? And just if I need to be a little bit clearer, you talked about assessing the power structure, but my thought is that corruption can override that. And I'm just curious about strategies that you might recommend.
Yeah. So depending upon the sphere that you're working in, one of the things that, unfortunately, as I was alluding to before, there's ego, vanity, pride, anxiety, fear, and then there's the more virtuous side. In most systems of power, there are different incentives, and you can pretty much assume that ego and vanity and pride and the will to power for many is fairly consistent, regardless of the motives that they have. And so one way to think about this is, let's assume you're dealing with a city council, and there are 9 members on the city council. And you understand that there is one specific member that you may consider to be corrupt in one way, shape, or form. First, I don't know where his or her incentives lie on the thing that you want to push. President Obama has an old line that he borrowed, certainly, which is, I can disagree with you on this and that, but it doesn't preclude me from working with you on this, this, and that. So there is an openness to, just because I perceive this person to be X, is there an opportunity to work with this person on Y, if that aligns? They are in power. I have to deal with the reality of what I am facing. Can't get around it. Elections happen every 2 or 4 years, but in between, there's life and governing. The next thing is, if that person, however, is an impediment to that thing that you care deeply about, there's an entire other coalition of 8 members who, for their own incentives and value system, may be in opposition to that person who is standing in the way. This is where allies in coalition building, unlikely bedfellows, the introduction of cognitive dissonance. That person who is in power, I said earlier, where do they derive their power? Legal, regulatory, reputational. Okay. In a political context, who are that person's donors? Do I have relationships with them? Do my allies have relationship with them? Even though they fundamentally disagree, think about incentives. What can I begin to do, not necessarily to change his or her mind, but to say, given their incentives, it is better for me in this set of circumstances to go along with this. And so it begins with a clinical assessment of measuring the world as it exists. And even in an instance where a person is corrupt in some way, shape, or form, if they are in that seat and they hold a tremendous amount of power, there are different strategies to deal and engage with them. Will it be successful all the time? No. Will it be successful sometimes? But what you will learn in each one of those is invaluable, and it sets you up for the next fight and the fight after that and the one that comes after that. Hopefully that is responsive to your really good question.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Sonia, for your question. Thank you, Frankie, as well, for your question earlier. What I love about what I'm hearing is that it actually, we can take these concepts, both justice and love, and be very practical in our application and in the way that we do relationships and in the way that we move justice and equity forward. Is that it takes strategy, but it also is very practical. So thank you for that very practical description, David. Nicole, I see that you have questions. Want to unmute you so that you can ask your question. And if anyone else, please feel free to post your question to the Q&A board. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. As a designer, I can't help but think about and wrestle with the relationship between justice and beauty. Unfortunately, so much destruction and pain has been inflicted in the name of justice, and much injustice in the name of beauty. From my faith-based perspective, true justice is beauty. However, it can often feel like I and we are aiming at an invisible target with so few good examples or manifestations where these two elements actually come together. So my question is, how do we effectively unravel and reweave these strands? And to connect it back to love, how can active love help us do that?
If I may actually start, something that comes immediately to mind, and I'll also open it to the panel. When we thought about this conversation, we also thought about Canva, and I know a lot of us may use Canva, especially now with being remote, but to show, for presentation purposes and for like social media. One of the things that we've seen that Canva has done really well is incorporated justice into their design elements and provide just like ready-made design responses to injustice. And so I've seen that company be committed to both beauty and justice in a really practical way so that justice can speak out on social media. But I also think that the framework that we offered earlier, and we can put that link back in the chat, the 5 love languages, in some ways, we think that the commitment to beauty and justice are expressed in our words, in the ways that we use our funds to invest in justice, to invest in justice, just to be clear there. Also, a beauty and is expressed in the relationships that we develop and our commitment to understanding issues of injustice and the full framework. So I hope that's in part responsive to your question, Nicole. But if anyone else has anything else to add on, I welcome you to do so.
I know for myself, being an artist, musician, that there's been times where, especially looking at this work, it seems overwhelming. There's so many different challenges. And what I've tried to do is just zoom in on where I'm passionate, and then also zoom in on where I'm most effective. And then also zoom in on what I think that I have the most expertise. So I'm passionate about finance. I feel like regardless of what people think about equality, everyone understands the idea of everyone deserves a right to be able to live and own something. So I put all of my effort there. And I think, I tell people all the time, I talked about that stat about the 1.5%, Black people owning 1.5% of wealth. well, my goal is if I can bump that from 1.5 to 1.6, I've done my job, you know, and just biting off the little bit that I can do and just playing my part in my part of the field. So.
Yeah, I think sometimes also it's the little things that impact a person that we wouldn't even think much about. You know, the word courtesy comes from two Greek words. One means the mind and one means friendly. So to be courteous is to be friendly minded. And when we're friendly minded, that is, we seek to treat everybody we encounter as though they were a friend, we lay the foundation for building friendships. My friend that I mentioned earlier, Clarence Schuler, he and his wife had just stopped at a rest stop, and there was a truck driver who had backed his truck into a very small space. And Clarence, my friend, who's black, said to this white driver, "Man, you did a great job at that. I'm amazed at that." And the guy chuckled and said, "Well, I've done it a few times." And here's what Clarence said to me. He said, "I'm hoping the fact that I put a smile on his face, the next time he encounters a black person, he's going to think differently toward them because I gave him a smile." You know, it's just the little personal things along the way, treating people with dignity and respect as though they were a friend. And maybe some of them will become friends, but at least we had a positive influence on them.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Thank you, Derek. Are there any other questions? So we have time for one more. If not, we're going to place in the chat a link to a feedback survey because we'd love to hear from you and to get your take on this experience. But we are just incredibly thankful for Derek for being here, Dr. Chapman, and for David. You've really inspired us, but also given us very practical ways of thinking about how to commit to and how to do justice in our own spheres of influence, and to also allow justice to shape our career paths. And the work that we do in our personal relationships. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for being here. If you could take a moment, might be a bit hidden, but we just placed into the chat the feedback survey. And on that note, we are going to wrap up. Thank you.
See you later. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Amelia. Appreciate what you did, what you've done, and all the others. Yeah, Derek and David. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Thanks, Derek.